Thank you, Vice Chancellor Rajkumar, for your superb and very generous words of introduction as well. It's always a pleasure to be back, and I say this not in the routine way that every speaker always says how pleased he or she is to be before all of you, but thank you genuinely. It's a pleasure because I have watched the journey of the Jindal Global University from when it was a gleam in his eye, and he was first talking about it with great excitement, enthusiasm, and I must say it seemed to me, improbable idealism, which he has been able to translate into concrete and glass and bricks, and most importantly, into students. So once again, congratulations to you, and thank you all of you for showing up here at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, when many of you might have far more interesting things to do than listen to an old guy talking to you about India and where we're heading, which you already know anyway, because you're already the majority in this country. So where we're heading depends on where you want to head. But having said that, great to have you all here. Thank you very much. It really is a joy. Really is a joy to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Jindal Global University by participating in this lecture series and really being able to relish the meteoric rise of JGU. I was telling Raj that while I am extremely admiring of him, I first met him when he was a young student and sort of considered him a kind of protege. Now I'm in awe of the man because of the institution that he has built up literally from scratch, from nothing at all. And I'm sorry Naveen Jindal couldn't be here. He's a good friend, and I really want to congratulate him for his vision, not just in backing such a university, but in entrusting it to a young man. I was saying to Raj that every new university in India is founded by an older person, including by retired vice chancellors of other universities. To entrust such a major, ambitious project to a young person who had never headed a university, who indeed became India's youngest vice chancellor, that was already a terrific and visionary act by Naveen Jindal. And please tell him I told him so. And of course, inaugurating that wonderful exhibition. And it gave me really genuine pleasure to see the various world university rankings that JGU is a proud part of. Because when I was minister in the Human Resources Development Ministry, soon rightly to be rebaptized the Education Ministry, I remember the frustrations that so many people felt about the consistent absence of Indian universities from any of these global rankings. And I'm very glad that Jindal has broken through, along with a handful of IITs and very few other institutions, in order to show the world that we are capable of replicating in a campus here at the edge of Haryana, a university that matches in facilities, in faculty ability, and in the talent and potential of its students, the best that the world has to offer. Well done, all of you. Now, my good friend, your Vice Chancellor, who has steered so much of these pivotal accomplishments, asked me to speak to you on the theme, India in Transition, from midnight to Millennium and Beyond. It's not easy to address all of this in the 45 minutes that he has given me, though I think Gitanjali Surendran has shown that you can do it admirably in 10. But still, the fact is that, at this time of the evening, the first rule of politics is don't stand too long between yourself and the audience's evening plans, including its dinner plans. I imagine that all of you don't want to be kept here too long. At the same time, I gather that in trying to cover the subject, we are going to leave some room for a question and answer exchange afterwards. So those of you who wish to cross swords with me, please do stay on till the end and raise your questions or comments. But with India having celebrated just now its 73rd anniversary of independence, the annual milestone has offered us a timely reminder of how far we've come from that momentous midnight moment of August 15, 1947, when independent India was first born, and our first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, proclaimed in those famous words that everyone of my generation learned by heart in school. I don't know if you folks did. A tryst with destiny, a moment which comes but rarely in history, when an age ends, when we pass from the old to the new, when we pass from the old to the new, when an age ends, and when the soul of a nation long suppressed finds utterance, quote unquote. Very, very famous speech. For the longest time, perhaps the most famous speech by an Indian, and words with which he launched India on a remarkable experiment in governance. In some ways remarkable because it was happening at all. India, Winston Churchill once barked, is merely a geographical expression. It is no more a single country than the equator. Now, of course, Churchill was rarely right about India. If you have any doubt, read my book, An Era of Darkness, you'll know. But it's true that no other country in the world embraces the extraordinary mixture of ethnic groups, the profusion of mutually incomprehensible languages, the varieties of topography and culture, the diversity of religions and cultural practices, the climate variations of the length and breadth of our country, and the range of levels of economic development that India does. And yet India is much more than the sum of its contradictions. Just thinking about India makes clear the immensity of the challenge of defining what it means just to be an Indian. How can you approach a land of both snow peaks and tropical jungles, with 23 major languages recognized in the Constitution and 22,000 distinct dialects, so-called, though these are in some cases spoken by more people than speak Danish or Norwegian, inhabited now in the second decade of the 21st century by over 1 billion individuals, 1.3 at last count, of every ethnic extraction known to humanity. How do you gauge a culture which elevated non-violence to an effective moral principle, but whose freedom was born in blood and whose independence still soaks in it? How can one determine the future of an ageless civilization that was the birthplace of 4 major religions, a dozen different traditions of classical dance, 85 major political parties recognized by the Election Commission, and 300 ways of cooking the potato? I mean, the fact is, the short answer is it can't be done, at least not to everyone's satisfaction. Any truism about India can be immediately contradicted by another truism about India. It's often jokingly said that anything you can say about India, the opposite is also true. And it goes to everything. Take the Indian economy, for example. We are making our policy choices in a democracy, and that too one with a majority of poor voters. So every MP represents a constituency where the majority of his or her voters live well below the $2 a day level that the World Bank celebrates. And so the basic issues of survival and redistribution assume a high priority in a way that very few other democracies have had to contend with. Most other democracies grew first and became democratic later. We started off on the challenge of growth as a democracy. There was no real universal suffrage in many of these Western countries prospered during the Industrial Revolution. But we actually grew when we were taking the needs of the poor as a priority, because they had the majority of the votes. And we sought to win their votes by offering them economic incentives. So redistributive policies have been very high throughout on the Indian national economic agenda. And I must say, as an MP, I personally feel there's no escape from the responsibility to pursue such policies because the voters are living so close to the margins. So the corollary of this is that economic policy has to be driven by the interests of the poor rather than by the taxpayers, unlike, again, Western democracies where taxpayers can have a strong voice in how their money is spent. Here, taxpayers in India are less than 5% of the voters. So non-taxpayers command more votes. They decide the agenda, not the taxpayer. That's another contradiction which you won't find in any other democracy. In a democracy, the politician's accountability is more to the majority of voters than to the minority of taxpayers. So, of course, as the economy grows and the taxpayer base broadens, this will change, but you'll have to be past my age before you're going to get to that stage in India, where the taxpayers will be the majority of the voters. Not yet, not for a long time. At the same time, India's economic development strategy has been affected by the fact that ours is a federal system, right? So whereas the European Union, I used to tell them, is 29 sovereign countries and one common market, we were, until the GST was adopted last year, one sovereign country and 29 markets, with differing state taxes, various limitations on interstate commerce, octroi, long lines of lorries lined up at every checkpost on the state frontier. As many of you, those of you who've been here more than 2 years, will remember, even driving from Sonipat to Delhi, you'd see the lorries of those checkposts. So all these things considered, the challenges faced in developing and growing the economy in the context of a democracy of mainly poor people is not something that you can very easily reduce to a simple paradigm. And it's just one example of the many challenges facing our country. And that's what makes, in many ways, it makes it all the more admirable to look at the journey we've made so far, the strides that India has taken in the face of daunting obstacles that in many ways have unlocked our potential with many, many challenges. I once said in a different context, in talking about the issue that Gitanjali mentioned, the whole question of British colonialism and why it was important to address the injustices of that period, I said to my younger audiences, if you don't know where you're coming from, how will you appreciate where you're going? And that, I think, is relevant as well to our theme today. So she's already told you about how I wrote this book at the time of the 50th anniversary. And I wrote about India at that time as standing on the cusp of four of the most important debates facing the world as we were nearing the end of the 20th century at that time. One of the debates I discussed was the Globalization Debate, which was just beginning to be active there. Globalization versus self-reliance. Should India, where economic self-sufficiency had been the mantra for more than 4 decades, open itself up to the global economy? Now, what we're doing today, where we become a very globalized economy, is a major change. It wasn't something we could take for granted when I wrote this book. And for more than 4 decades, one could argue that the choices we made were the opposite of what we've made now, and the consequences also, because we suffered from what I call the economics of nationalism, which equated political independence with economic self-sufficiency, and so largely isolated India from the world economy. Now, most of you probably today, in this generation at JGU, will axiomatically associate capitalism with freedom. But it would be unwise to forget that the great leaders of Indian nationalism associated capitalism with slavery. Why? Because the East India Company was the face of capitalism. They came to India to trade, they stayed on to rule, and the result was that they actually transformed our country for the worse. In many ways, I've described how in 1700, we were 27% of the global economy, according to the research done by the British econometric historian Angus Maddison. As late as 1800, 23% of the global economy. When the British left in 1947, we were less than 3% of the global economy. We had been reduced by 1947, after 2 centuries of exploitation, loot, and drainage of resources, into one of the poorest, most backward, most illiterate and diseased societies on the earth, from having been the richest and most prosperous one that everyone wanted to come and trade with. From 1900 to 1947, for example, the rate of growth of the Indian economy was not even 0.1%, while population grew steadily at over 3.5%. Imperial rule left a society with merely 17% literacy, practically no domestic industry, and over 90% living below what today we'd call the poverty line. So the impoverishment of India was absolutely the starkest reality that India's nationalist leaders had to face. It was therefore natural that our domestic transformation was our overriding priority, because that's where we started from. Now, if you look at those numbers today, whatever else we may have done wrong, and God knows India's been far from perfect, we made many mistakes, but that 90% below the poverty line is now closer to 20. Okay, the literacy rate, which was 17%, is now 79. And by the way, in 1947, the literacy rate for women was 8.8%, which means if you put 100 women in the room, you'd get 8 or maybe 9 women just about who could read and write. That was what India was like. Today, women too are up at almost 70%. One figure I didn't mention is that life expectancy in 1947 was merely 26, which meant that, of course, it's an averaged figure, so they take all the infants passing away soon after birth, maternal mortality, all of which were very high under British rule, and the average, it didn't mean that nobody lived beyond 26, it meant that the average age in India of the average Indian person born in India in 1947 was 26. Today, that average life expectancy is 70. So when some people say this government or this country achieved nothing in 60 years, please tell them just look at these numbers and understand that a great deal was achieved in these first 7 decades of independence. But I got distracted from talking about globalization. The fact is that because of that East India Company experience, our nationalist leaders were suspicious of every foreigner with a briefcase, seeing him as the thin end of a neo-imperial wedge. And so instead of integrating India into the global capitalist system, as very few post-colonial countries did, Singapore is an outstanding example of that, India's leaders were convinced that the political independence they'd fought for could only be guaranteed through economic independence. So self-reliance became the slogan, and the protectionist barriers went up, and India spent 45 years with bureaucrats rather than businessmen on the commanding heights of the economy, spending a good part of our first 4.5 decades after independence on subsidizing unproductivity, regulating stagnation, and trying to distribute poverty. Which only goes to prove that one of the lessons you can learn from history is that history can sometimes teach you the wrong lessons. Of course, we also have a government that has learned the wrong lessons from history, but that's a different subject. You can ask me in the Q&A. So the result of all these choices in reaction to the colonial experience was what was derisively called the Hindu rate of growth, at which India chugged along at 3%, while much of the rest of Asia shot ahead. Resources that the state could have spent on infrastructure development, education, health, agricultural reform, went instead on largely inefficient public sector projects that employed many but produced little. It's sadly possible to quantify the economic losses inflicted on India over 4 decades of entrepreneurs frittering away their energies in queuing for licenses rather than manufacturing products, paying bribes instead of hiring new workers, wooing politicians instead of understanding consumers, and getting things done through bureaucrats rather than doing things for themselves. The disastrous inefficiencies of that system were masked by subsidies from the national exchequer and a combination of vested interests, whether it was socialist ideologues, political opportunists, bureaucratic managers, self-protective trade unions, or captive markets, shielded it fiercely from economic reality, and millions of Indians continue to languish in poverty. And the architects of the system, fortunately, were amongst the first to realize what was wrong, and a veteran economist like Manmohan Singh, as India's finance minister Narasimha Rao, presided over that dramatic liberalization in 1991, when in that famous speech, budget speech to the Lok Sabha, he said, paraphrasing Victor Hugo, that no power on earth can stop an idea whose time has come. And of course, what had come was the time for the liberalization of the Indian economy, which gave us not only the growth and diversity and the prosperity that enabled us to weather the storms that confronted the global economy after the crisis of 2008 onwards, but also enabled us to overtake Japan to become the 3rd largest economy in the world in purchasing power parity PPP terms. Indeed, given that core fundamental strength of the Indian economy, as recently as 2015, the IMF predicted that the Indian economy would be the fastest growing major economy in the world, a prediction that has only been derailed because of the successive tragic impacts of two disastrous man-made decisions, demonetization, the single worst blow the Indian economy has ever suffered since independence, and the botched implementation of what was otherwise a good idea, the GST. So we have unfortunately crippled ourselves, shot ourselves in the foot. But the fact is that basic changes that have occurred have been for the good. Economic reform is here to stay, even if sometimes reform seems to be pursued with the hesitancy of governments looking constantly over their electoral shoulders. You know, economic reforms remind me sometimes of the old saying about Indian diplomacy, which I was told by a grizzled old diplomat when I, as a 21-year-old, researching my PhD thesis, was stalking the corridors of the foreign ministry. I met this already retired diplomat who said, "You know, my boy, Indian diplomacy is like the lovemaking of an elephant." So I was, you can imagine, a bit startled. He explained, he said, it's conducted at a very high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years. Now, Indian diplomacy. I don't see Ambassador Mohan Kumar anymore. I think he's already fled in anticipation. Oh, there he is. I want to assure you that Indian diplomacy has become much more sprightly than those days. But the fact is that the same can certainly now be said of Indian economic reform, which is very often promulgated from on high with much fanfare, and then takes an age to be implemented because of all the vested interests and obstacles that have to be overcome. So this government is now in its sixth year. It's been talking from the very first moment about land reform, labor reform, all sorts of changes which still remain at the level of talk and on paper. But you know, it's a bit of a cliche to speak of India as a land of paradoxes, and yet it's so blessedly true. You know, we are a land that's an ancient civilization, but also a young republic. Our IT experts stride confidently into the 21st century, but much of our population seems to live in each of the other 20 centuries. The opposites, of course, quite often exist quite cheerfully. One of my favorite images of India, and this goes back 10 years now, was from the Kumbh Mela then, back in 2007 or 6. It was a picture of a naked sadhu, right out of central casting, right? You know, when some Bollywood director says, "Get me naked sadhu #1," you can just see this guy, ash-smeared forehead, Rudraksha mala around his neck, you know, warts on his face, matted hair, long grey matted hair hanging to his shoulders. Of course, malas and bangles and marks and so on, but not a stitch of clothing, sitting out there and staring into the distance, for all the world a picture of timeless otherworldliness. But in this particular picture, this naked sadhu doing all of that, looking just like that, was chatting away on a mobile cell phone. Now that, to me, was in many ways emblematic of what was happening to India, and that's why I wrote a book in 2007, 10 years after India from Midnight to Millennium, called The Elephant, the Tiger, and the Cell Phone. But how the cell phone was the instrument that's transforming the lumbering, slow-moving Indian elephant into the sprightly and agile tiger. And the truth is that cliches are cliches because they're true. And the paradoxes of India really say something painfully real about our society. A place where bullock carts are still an indispensable mode of transportation for millions, but which became, of course, the first country to successfully launch a mission to Mars and succeed in reaching its orbit on the first attempt. Nobody's done that. Mangalyaan is a world first. The US has done Mars orbiters after many failures. Europe has done Mars orbiters many failures. China and Japan have kept trying and have failed. They still haven't done a Mars orbit. India did try and succeed on its first attempt. No small cheese. And you know, when I talk to audiences about the fact that if you Google the phrase frugal innovation, the first 20 hits will all relate to Indian inventions, it's because we are the world masters of frugal innovation. That Mangalyaan mission actually cost our ISRO less than the special effects budget of the Hollywood space movie Gravity. So and it was 11% of what NASA spent on its own Mars shot. So that's, again, a big strength of India. Now, these paradoxes, therefore, go well beyond the nature of our entry into the 21st century, because our teeming cities are overflowing, while 2 out of 3 Indians still scratch a living from the soil. We've been recognized for all practical purposes as a leading nuclear power, satellite power, rocket power, but more than 240 million still have no access to electricity. And there are daily power cuts even in the nation's capital, even where I live, in privileged Lutyens, Delhi. And power deficits, massive losses. Apparently 23% of the power that India generates is still wasted in the process of transmission and distribution. And you think such a basic thing. There are countries seemingly far less sophisticated than India, which never know of a power cut. They just manage to get their electricity systems working all right. Why can't we do something as basic as that right? It's something that constantly makes me tear my hair out, but it's there. It's part of the reality. It's striking, we are the world's leading manufacturer for generic medicine for illnesses such as AIDS, but we have 3 million of our own citizens without access to AIDS medication. We have another 2 million with TB that's gone beyond treatability. Tens of millions with no healthcare center or clinic within 10 kilometers of their places of residence. We're only spending 1.2% of our GDP on public health, in comparison to China's 3%, and of course 8.3% in the US, which may not be a role model because they overpay for everything. But the fact still is, as a percentage of GDP, we are way behind the rest of the world, and we have major health challenges. Ours is a country where one major health setback can destroy an entire generation in a family. A poor family will, if they imagine the bread earner, the wage earner in the family gets a life-threatening disease, a heart attack, cancer, advanced diabetes is diagnosed, whatever, they will end up selling their home for treatment. They will have to end up, and there's no one bringing in any income, so whatever savings have been accumulated are gone, and the entire economic prosperity of that family is wiped out by one single illness. That's the reality in India, and we just have to do much more about it than we're doing. Or the fact that, I talked about this mobile phones, the cell phones, and we do hold the world record for the largest number of cell phones sold every single month. But we also hold the world record for the largest number of farmers' suicides every year. Because as you know, when crops fail, our farmers, faced with a crippling mountain of debt, are simply seeing no other way out for themselves and their families than to take their own lives. That kind of despair, which has reached levels so high that the government is now suppressing the figures, which certainly the previous government never did. That is an indication of how much despair there is in our society. So paradoxes all the way, contrasts all the way, opposites holding true all the way. I'll tell you, in November 2007, just as I was deciding to come back to India, the prestigious Forbes magazine list of the world's top 10 billionaires had to make room for 10 new Indian names. And that took the total to $58 billionaires from India at that time. Then the number promptly dropped to 27 in the 2008 issue after the financial convulsions that year. Then it went up to 90 in 2015. And as of 2017, there are 101 Indian dollar billionaires with a combined net worth of $479 billion, greater than the GDP of a majority of the member states of the United Nations. Now, at the same time, we have 363 million people living below the poverty line. And I'm not referring to the UN World Bank poverty line I mentioned earlier, now been revised to $1.9 a day, but to the Indian poverty line, which in the rural areas is still pegged at 32 rupees or 47 cents, US cents a day. In other words, a line that's been drawn just this side of the funeral pyre. And I can go on with these contradictions. If we're looking at Midnight to the Millennium and Beyond, we've trained world-class scientists and engineers, but 400 million of our compatriots are still illiterate. We also have more children who have not seen the inside of a school than any other country in the world does. We have 4.3 million child laborers, reliable estimates. 40% of the children in our government schools drop out before the 8th standard. 487 million people in our workforce, but more than 2/3 of our employers are struggling to find employable workers. There have been surveys by FICCI, ASSOCHAM, CII, and so on, in which the dissatisfaction of employers with the potential recruitment pool has varied from 62 to 80%. Because they feel that the people who are applying for jobs, often with college degrees, just don't have any useful knowledge from their college education. I know Jindal is different. You folks are very, very privileged to be in a place of this quality, and don't forget that. But there's a larger world out there where people don't have these opportunities and these advantages. Do you know we produce 500,000, 5 lakh, 500,000 engineers every year, and 66% of them end up in jobs that do not require an engineering degree, and that is if they end up in jobs at all? That's the situation. And one of the reasons is because the engineering degrees they have are next to useless. They don't have a qualification that any employer finds particularly relevant. And even those from the better institutions, if an Infosys or a Tata consultancy services hires you, they will shove you into a campus and re-educate you for a year. And this is not on-the-job training, which every company does. This is remedial education to bring you up to scratch, to be professionally employable after they've hired you. That's what's happening in some of our leading companies. So there's a serious crisis in our country in terms of education. And you know, when you look at even blue-collar workers, 2.3% of our entire workforce has formal skills, diploma, qualification, welding, plumbing, masonry, whatever it may be. In comparison to 52% of the labor force in the US, 68% in the UK, and God knows 80-something in Germany. That's the kind of, we're 2.3% of our workers are actually qualified to do the work we're demanding of them. We celebrate India's IT triumphs, but information technology has employed a grand total of 5 million people in the last 20 years. That's all. Okay? 10 million people, young people, are entering the workforce each year, and we don't have enough jobs for them. Many of our urban youth rightly say with confidence that their future will be better than their parents' past, but that's folks like you at Jindal. For the rest, there are Maoist insurgencies violently disturbing the peace. In 165 of our districts, there have been such incidents. And these are largely made up of unemployed young men who have no stake in the future of our country because we have not equipped them with the education, the skills, the ability to take advantage of the opportunities that a growing India might have been able to offer them. So, the government that has been re-elected, and that was elected first in 2014 and now re-elected this year, very much rode in on a campaign of economic reform and providing economic opportunity for our citizens, particularly our young citizens. And the great barriers that still impede the India story have not yet fully been overcome. The chronic problem of corruption, for example. We all know that corruption is something which has been decried from the very top in our country, but India still ranks 78th amongst the 175 countries on Transparency International's Corruption Perception Index. A foreign entity looking to set up a business in India even today still has to battle tedious rules, uncertain tax regulations, unpredictable ones, excessive paperwork, inordinate delays in the processing of that paperwork. We heard the Prime Minister telling us now for 5 years about improving our ease of doing business rankings of the World Bank. We have improved to some degree, though it only measures Bombay and Delhi. We've gone up to 77th out of 190. But China ranks 46th, the US ranks 8th. So what are they doing right that we're not doing? And I think that many people in the business world, perhaps some of your parents, will tell you that ease of doing business is much easier said than done. Our infrastructure remains a major challenge. In one of the sound bites you heard in that video, you hear me years ago saying that we need $1 trillion of investment in our infrastructure. And by the way, thank you for all those who did that video. It was wonderful. And it was very cleverly put together, because normally what happens is you see somebody 10 years ago looking youthful and fresh, and they're getting older and tireder and more jaded. But here they went in the opposite direction. So clearly, Jindal believes in youthfulness and hope as the right direction for us to aim for, and I shall be inspired by that. But the fact is that that our infrastructure needs still that $1 trillion of investment, whether it's in highways, whether it's in high-speed trains. I'm not talking about bullet trains, which may probably never be economically viable in our country. I'm just talking about high-speed trains. I mean, the average speed of our trains in our country is actually well under 100 kilometers an hour. I think the average speed of passenger trains is about 30 kilometers an hour, which is almost, what a good long-distance sprinter can do. It's a shame that we're just not being able to keep up with what's happening elsewhere in the world and all this. Similarly, many of our ports still rely on manual labor to move cargo, and a lot of infrastructure development is only in the big cities and not elsewhere. The internet, I mean, that's been the big hope for India post the millennium, that we will transform ourselves through the internet, that it's an arena full of possibilities, but it remains out of reach still for most Indians. Of course, there's a revolution going on. Each of you probably has a mobile phone. 4G is now much more widely available and inexpensive in India. But if you look at our villages, the government has still struggled to provide connectivity even to 10% of our villages in the last year. The last mile is not connected. Wi-Fi and broadband are pretty much unavailable there. And we're living in an era, frankly, where 4G is more important than Modi ji. So it really is something that I just didn't want you guys falling asleep, so to say a few things. The average internet speed in India, there's a global list ranking, is apparently 6.5 Mbps, okay? Average internet speed, which puts us 74th out of 75 countries in the world in global rankings that have been measured. So we are well below averages, and we shouldn't get too many illusions. There's a long way we have to go. But we should always look at this bad news, as I often do, as an incentive to do better, not as a cause for despair. Don't get me wrong. I'm not one of those farmers who's about to give up on you. We need to say we've got to prevent what's going wrong from continuing to go wrong by identifying these problems and tackling them with a will. I mentioned the internet, but let me give you another example. I'm one of those opposition MPs who continues every day to decry what's happening in Kashmir, to talk about the fact that it's inhuman for Indian citizens to live without telephone connections, without the internet, without parents being able to take their children to school because they don't know if anything goes wrong, whether anyone can call them and tell them, so they don't take their kids to school. College examinations have been postponed for over a month now. It's a real problem. But I will tell you that when there was internet and there was still trouble and violence and terrorism, I remember meeting a young Kashmiri boy telling me that he had developed a very successful $1 million a year business just selling Kashmiri handicrafts on the internet to Indian and international customers. So it's transformed. I think of that poor boy today and what's happened to his business when for 1 month he can't receive any orders and no one can be in touch with him. But that's one of the reasons why I want the government to quickly end this state of siege in Kashmir. But it's also a reminder of the potential that if you want Kashmiris to thrive and prosper and so on, they need the blessed internet, and that's a very, very important consideration that you should bear in mind. Now, we know that a lot of things that I've said you already know, but I felt it was important to remind you. We talked about globalization earlier. I mean, globalization, I didn't sort of wax eloquent about it because you've all got very used to that term. Some years ago, I found myself cracking a very weak joke on globalization, which I'll repeat only because we not too long ago had the 20th anniversary of the tragic death of Princess Diana. And I remember saying, that reminds me of how globalized the world has become. And people say, what's Princess Diana got to do with globalization? And my answer was very simple. I said, look at this. An English princess with a Welsh title leaves a French hotel with an Egyptian companion who has supplanted a Pakistani. She gets into a German car with a Dutch engine and is driven by a Belgian chauffeur full of Scottish whiskey. They're chased by Italian paparazzi on Japanese motorcycles into a Swiss-built tunnel where they crash. An American doctor briefly attempts the rescue using Brazilian medicines. And now the whole story is told to you in Sonepat, Haryana by the MP for Thiruvananthapuram. There's globalization. But globalization has its dark side too, and I don't just mean the tragic loss of an English princess. I mean, look, for example, at the latest Oxfam World Inequality Report. You know, the assets of just the 26 richest people in the world are equal to the combined wealth of the bottom 50% of the world's population. Okay, so the 50% of the world's population just produces 1% of the world's wealth, and 1% of the fortune of the world's richest man is equivalent to the entire health budget of the entire country of Ethiopia. Entire health budget of 105 million people in Ethiopia, 1% of the fortune of the world's richest man. There are probably similar figures available for the India's richest man, but I won't say it. Now, the truth is that I've always argued as a politician, as a public intellectual, whatever you think I am, that in India, whether we grow at 9% as we once did or 5% as we seem to be growing today, what really matters is that 25% at the bottom of our socio-economic pyramid. Everything we do must be by the yardstick of what are we doing for those 25%? How are we giving them opportunities? When I say that I'm in favor of liberalization and I'm in the Congress party which is strongly in favor of social justice, I'm saying let's distribute some of the fruits of that liberalization to those who have nothing, the marginalized, the people excluded. And this is denounced by some as povertarianism and welfareism and so on. My answer is very simple. I've said this in Parliament. The magic of the market will not appeal to people who cannot afford to enter the marketplace. You need to give them that leg up. You need to give them some help. Then they can enter the marketplace and become consumers and be part of your growth story. Right now, they're completely left out of our narrative. And that's something we simply can't afford to forget. Now, as I said, I'm not trying to be grim and pessimistic because I'm chronically an optimist. And I define optimism as regarding the future with uncertainty. That is, a pessimist says, oh, everything is bad, everything is bound to go wrong, we're going to hell in a handbasket. The optimist, in my definition, says, look, things can go right. There is potential. If we do things right, we can pull it off. That's my belief. But that's why I feel it's my job to hammer away every day at both what's wrong, so we can do it right, and what can be right and what we've done right before, so we can be right again. That's the message that I give to you young people here in OP Jindal University, as we look beyond in the title of my speech. I think all of you are bright, you're well qualified, you're in a demanding university. I know it wasn't easy to get in. You've got to keep up with a world-class curriculum and top teachers. But I want you to remember that while you're in this ivory tower, which it is, even if there's no ivory around, okay, this chrome and glass and wood and brick tower, the fact is that we are still in a country where we still haven't fully provided our Aam Aadmi with roti, kapda and makan. And don't forget, Aam Aadmi's demands have grown. So what used to be just roti, kapda and makan when I was your age, then became bijli, sadak and pani also, pine ka pani. And then beyond that, you can add kitab and naukri, rozgar, and perhaps broadband internet as well to the wish list that every Indian feels they must have access to. And the truth is that this is something that honestly we all need to do. We need to find innovative ways to achieve that. And young India, all of you, you have to find the way. Our lot have done our best to some degree, done our worst in some ways as well. But we are increasingly having to cede place. 50%, 50.1% of our population is under 25. 65% is under 35. So you are the majority in this country. Not even the youngest vice chancellor qualifies. We're all part of this older minority in this country that is sitting here representing that famous economist chart that showed that India holds still, even under the present government, the world record for the largest gap between the average age of the population and the average age of the cabinet. So there is no country with a larger gap than India. And so it's a bunch of old people trying to make a future for a young population. And that's where you need to take the challenge up yourself. As far as demography is concerned, many of you heard about a demographic dividend. Next year, 2020, the average age in Japan is going to be 47. In Europe, it's going to be 46. Even in America, it'll be 40. Whereas in India, it'll still be 29. It's 27 today. We'll suddenly have a bit of an age boost. So you folks, you actually represent potentially a dynamic, energetic, youthful population that could be the engine of the world when the rest of the world is aging. But that demographic dividend that India needs requires people to be educated, qualified, to be able to respond to the needs of the marketplace, to be able to innovate and come up with ideas, to have the commitment and the passion that fueled the spirit of our great nationalists at that midnight moment. And at the same time, when I speak of optimism, you must be amongst those who say, we can do it right. We can do the right thing. We can do the thing right. And we can take India forward into the future. When you leave an institution of excellence, or what have they called you, Raj? Institution with potential for excellence. Eminence, I beg your pardon. Eminence. There is another university that doesn't exist yet that got the similar tag. So I was saying that must be an award for imminence, not for eminence. It'll be imminently coming up. But this is one for eminence, and all of you, I think, will have on your shoulders the future of our republic. As Gitanjali Surendran pointed out, we've had a number of very disturbing, very troubling developments in recent while, including, in particular, this pressure for conformity that she mentioned and I've written about more recently than in the book she read, because in the book she read, I was still happily celebrating diversity and non-conformism. But today there's much more this nationalist fervor, this anxiety to define dissidents as anti-national, this rush to seeing seditious behavior in the most innocent dissent, and finally this pressure to conform, which clearly has infected many of our media channels, television channels. But if you are idealist enough to know that you believe in certain things and you will stand for those principles, that India's age-old struggles deserve new solutions, that you will think globally, as Jindal Global University requires you to, but you will also look to India, whether new India or old India or remade India. It should be an India that you can help reshape into a better India for all. I do think that we can't forget the old challenges. We have to overcome our poverty. We have to deal with the hardware of development, the ports, the roads, the airports, all the infrastructural progress I mentioned, and the software of development, the human capital, the need for the ordinary person in India to have a couple of square meals a day, to be able to send his or her children to a decent school, to aspire to work a job will give them meaning in their life and opportunities to transform themselves. And we have to tackle and end corruption. All of these are real challenges that none of us, government or opposition, can pretend don't exist. You must recognize that this should take place as I thought it was taking place when I wrote that book 20 years ago, 22 years ago, in an open and inclusive society, in a rich and diverse and plural civilization, in one that's open to the contestation of ideas and interests within it, that's unafraid of dissent, unafraid of the prowess or the products of the outside world, wedded to the democratic pluralism that has always been India's greatest strength, and determined to liberate and fulfill the creative energies of its people. Gitanjali was mentioning how I dwelt a little bit in my book on unity and diversity. You know, we're living in a time when our Muslim brothers and sisters have been made to feel very different, made to feel a shadow over their very names and identities. And you know, it's striking. We had 13 presidents. We've had 13, no, we've now had 14 presidents, I guess, 3 of whom have been Muslims. We've had innumerable governors, cabinet ministers, chief ministers of states, ambassadors, generals, Supreme Court justices and chief justices from that community. During the war with Pakistan in 1971, the Indian Air Force in the northern sector was commanded by a Muslim, Air Marshal, later Air Chief Marshal Latif. And that's something that our country, the Paramveer Chakra was won in 1965 by a Muslim soldier who single-handedly was responsible for one of the great victories of that intense war. Where do some people get the idea that they can define Indian nationhood, belonging, sense of sacrifice to this country on the basis of religion? I find it sad. I was in this memorial to the famous ship that was sunk in the 1971 war. Captain Mullah went down with the ship. And the name of every single sailor, beg your pardon, on that ship is enshrined on this marble slab. And I was reading every name, and there is not one religion in India unrepresented amongst those who gave their lives for our country. You will find Hindus, and you will find Christians, and you will find Sikhs, and you will find Muslims. And let me tell you, when you go to the Andaman Islands, to the notorious cellular jail, where the British imprisoned some of our nationalist heroes, and you look at the names on the wall there of those who were imprisoned sometimes for decades, those who died there, again, every religion of India is represented on those names. Don't let anybody tell you that you don't belong in this country. Every religion has a claim on the idea of India, on the essence of what India is all about. And I want to tell you that the kind of competitive chauvinisms we're seeing in our politics is something I'm disgusted by and I deplore. And I will fight against it. I will raise my voice. However many cases are filed against me, and there have been 4 so far, there will be more. I believe to even talk of majority and minority is fundamentally un-Indian. We are all Indians. The suggestion that only a Hindu, and that too only a certain kind of Hindu, can be an authentic Indian is an affront to the very premises of Indian nationalism. And India, and I think she quoted that very appropriately, an India that denies itself to some of us will end up denying itself to all of us. The misuse of history in our politics, using the past to haunt the present, encouraging a cycle of violence going on, spawning new hostages to history, ensuring that future generations will be taught old wrongs to set right in the new India. That must stop. The great Mexican writer Octavio Paz said that we live between oblivion and memory. I remember having a dinner conversation in Davos with the late Israeli President Shimon Peres. And he said to me, I hate history. And I said, what are you talking about? I'm a historian, I love history. How can you say you hate history? And he said, because history is used everywhere only to remember the wrongs and to stoke up fears and resentments and hatreds. He said, I want my grandson to only think of the future. I don't want him to think of the past. Now that was a very sobering statement. But if he had come to today's India, he would understand why many others in India might agree with him. As somebody who cares for history, I would say history is not a web woven by innocent hands, but at the same time, it can be a story of the past to help us understand where we are today. It does not have to be something that determines how we behave in the future. We must not ever reduce our own fellow citizens to second-class citizens in our homeland. That would be a second partition, and it would be a partition much worse. It would be a partition in the Indian soul, much worse than the partition that once took place in the Indian soil. So let me try and wrap all my themes up with a story. It's a story from our ancient Puranas. It's a story, typical Indian story of a sage and his disciples. Where the sage asks his disciples, when does the night end? And the disciples quickly say, well, at dawn, of course. And he says, I know that. When does the night end and the dawn begin? So the first disciple, who's of course from the tropical south of India where I come from, he replies, I know. When the first glimmer of light across the sky reveals the palm fronds on the coconut trees swaying gently in the breeze across the paddy fields, that is when the night ends and the dawn begins. But the sage says, no, my son. He turns to the other disciple who's from even north of here. And that guy says, I know, it's when the first streaks of sunshine make the snow gleam and glitter on the mountaintops of the Himalayas. There's glinting off the ice and snow on the tops of the mountains. That is when the night ends and the dawn begins. And the sage says, no, my sons. He says, when two travelers from the opposite ends of our land meet and embrace each other as brothers, and when they realize they sleep under the same sky, see the same stars, and dream the same dreams, that is when the night ends and the dawn begins. We have seen many a dark night in the history of our India, including in the very recent past and present of our India. Dawn will come. Let us remain faithful to the founding values of that midnight moment. Let us conquer the challenges that have gone beyond the millennium that face us in the 21st century. Let us build truly a better India rather than a new India or an old one. Let us build an India that will truly shine, but let it shine for all. Thank you very much, and Jai Hind.